This is SSN.
Stories Studio Network.
The Change for Good Roads podcast series brings together influential Canadian experts from sectors of sustainable cities, equity, accessibility, physical activity, mobility, and road safety to discuss how to increase support for road safety action. Hosted by Parachute's President and CEO Pamela Fuselli, each episode will feature a discussion with an expert on urban road safety. Welcome to the first episode of Parachute's Change for Good Roads podcast. Today we'll be exploring the importance of economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable cities as a key component of healthy, active, and safe urban roads. Safe, healthy, and sustainable urban roads are only possible if we treat the underlying issues as a complex problem, one that involves not only urban planning, but also public health, engineering, and other sectors, and retains a focus on inclusion, equity, sustainability, community, and more. There are a range of evidence-based frameworks and interventions that guide global efforts towards safer, healthier, and more sustainable roads. The Decade of Action for Road Safety 2021 to 2030 promotes the Safe System approach and Vision Zero, and sets out targets and goals to guide us to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Through cross-sectoral collaboration, organizations and individuals are able to make our cities both safer for all road users and healthier for all citizens. Joining me today is Mike Layton. Mike is a Canadian municipal politician who has served as the city councillor for Ward 19 in Toronto from 2010 to 2022. He is the son of former Member of Parliament and leader of the NDP, Jack Layton. Mike is an advocate for progressive policies, including affordable housing, public transit expansion, and environmental sustainability. He has been instrumental in leading initiatives such as the creation of a new bike lane network and establishing Toronto's first Indigenous Affairs office. Mike also serves on several boards and committees related to urban planning and development. Mike, thanks for being part of Parachute's Change for Good Roads, our first episode on this podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Pamela.
So we'll start off with a straightforward question. What does a sustainable city look like to you?
To me, a sustainable city looks at not only the environmental aspects locally, the natural environment of community, the air quality, the biodiversity, as well as the water quality in a localized environment, but also the contributions that local community makes to the global. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, you have social sustainability. Does every member of a community have access to housing, have access to food, have access to all of the other things one needs to have a good quality of life? That includes economic sustainability, because both those elements, the social and the environmental, depend on economic sustainability in a way that not only allows us to advance technologically, but also sustain the government systems and the social systems that require some type of economic growth in a system in order to function. So it really is all those things. Can someone live, have a good quality of life, and at the same time be having a positive, or at least not a negative, impact on their environment? Something, and I hate to borrow from the Indigenous worldview, not being Indigenous myself, but I think there's something to be said to the notion of 7 generations. Looking 7 generations forward, what does the world look like? What does a community look like? What does society look like at that point? It's a very powerful way of thinking about sustainability, and it's one that I hold deeply in my heart. And so I think that necessitates, though, the social elements and dynamics of sustainability, as well as the environmental and climate ones. And then in between those, there's a bridge of economic sustainability that needs to exist as well.
Yeah, and I think what you've talked about is an example of how complex the issues are and how interrelated they are. And that's one of the things on this podcast that we're looking to highlight is those intersections of issues like climate and in the environment and healthy active living. And so can you talk a bit about how sustainable cities are linked to road safety? Another area that people may not think of immediately as linked to those other areas.
It's literally where the sustainable rubber hits the road. I love it. I love it. So when you look at how cities function, how societies function, we have these arteries that link our homes to where we shop and get food, to where we take our kids to school, to where we get to work and or school, to where we go out and enjoy the nature within the city and outside of the city. These are the arteries that help our society function. They also help the economy function, the movements of goods around a city that end up in our homes or in our places of work or in other people's places of work. And so it's critically important that we capture the road system and transportation, not only of people, but of goods within our discussion about sustainability. Because cities cannot be sustainable if we don't have a functional transportation system, whether it's sidewalks, roads, or rail lines. So we do have to look through the sustainability lens at how we move people around, but it's incredibly important to the overall sustainability, the movement of people and goods around our social system. So looking at how, let's view our current or sort of the last 200 years of transportation in cities that have been predominantly built around the use of the single occupancy vehicles, of moving cars around, moving large trucks around. That we moved from a time when it was footpaths in much of the world and to narrow roads for horses and carts, to then rebuilding cities or building cities for cars and then rebuilding cities post-war for cars as well, or through revitalization of downtown cores to make them more accessible for automobiles, because that seemed to be the dominant form of transportation in the cities. But unfortunately, we all know that's not sustainable from a number of different angles. One, the burning of gasoline isn't particularly sustainable for the local environment, for the economy, or for our entire species as a whole moving forward, because of the contributions of greenhouse gases, the fact that it's a limited resource that will run out at some point in time, and the fact that while burning it produces terrible chemicals from an environmental and health perspective. Then added to that, we simply can't continue down the path of single occupancy vehicles getting people to work every day. You look at our road system, you can't just keep adding lanes. They tried that, it failed miserably. And the fact is, we need to look at different ways of getting people around. Public transportation has been there for, I was going to say for decades, but for centuries, perhaps more, when we look at how we move mass amounts of people through dense areas. And the fact is, that buses and subways are the backbone of sustainable transportation in cities, much like buses networks and rail networks are in regions. And so we've got that sort of level of increased sustainability as we look to move larger numbers of people around by using less energy and less space within the right of way. And then finally, for many years, I would say sort of up to the post-war period, I'm not a historian on the subject matter, so I'll it just seems to me that there was a switch in the 40s and 50s from building neighborhoods for people to walk around. I live in downtown Toronto, small lot sizes, grid-like streets, a grocery store every 3-4 blocks. That pattern allows for my family to live a lifestyle to have a great quality of life without owning a car. The problem is you go 4 kilometers, even 2 kilometers west or north of me, the urban fabric isn't built that way. It's built so you need to own a car just to go out and get milk. That is not a sustainable pattern when from a climate point of view. And I would also say from a quality of life social point of view or economic point of view, if you're requiring to use so much energy just to get some of those basic necessities. And so I think that brings us all to like what does a more sustainable transportation pattern look like in cities? And that means more people out of their cars. So cities built with that in mind, built where you can go and do everything you need to in a day without needing a car. And then added to that, how do people get around without cars? Strong public transportation systems that are easily accessible to people, that are comfortable to ride in, that are safe, and that also are inexpensive. So that we add that social dynamic to our transportation system, and then finally, and one that or two that I'm known for or was known for in the city of Toronto was around pedestrians and increasing the comfort and safety for pedestrians in our cities, and then cycling and building out a cycling network so people can get around cities effectively and efficiently using a low carbon and inexpensive mode of transportation that also happens to be super fun to do as long as you have safe infrastructure. It can be incredibly scary and frustrating when you don't, and incredibly fun and liberating when you do. And so I've fortunately been part of building out a network of bike lanes in the city of Toronto I'm quite proud of, and I use on a very regular basis.
Well, we saw how many people got out of their vehicles and onto bike lanes and walking in the past couple of years, and how much they enjoyed that and wanted to do that. But they, as you said, need to feel safe. And I live in a completely opposite area from you. That is, you do have to drive anywhere to get to services or goods that you need. And they continued to build those types of suburban areas that just, they have choices that they could make differently as they're even building up the area around where I live. They could have made different choices so that it becomes more sustainable. So what are some of the common challenges that cities or municipalities experience when they're trying to develop a sustainable city? And I guess it differs from building new versus trying to retrofit.
I think it's kind of funny because from the municipal government's perspective, it's more efficient to build dense neighborhoods. It's more efficient. It's cheaper, not only the cost up front, but also the longer term maintenance. It's better for cities to have much more dense neighborhoods. It's more efficient for garbage trucks to go down the street when they're straight, for buses that can do more efficient routes. But we still end up in this position where we're building suburbs that look like amoebas rather than look like lines on a piece of paper. That would just how it sounds really boring, but it's exactly how cities should be built, or at least those patterns should be kept in mind when building communities, because that allow for that kind of growth. There are cities that have beautiful patterns that aren't a perfect grid, that work very efficiently. But the fact is, what we're building is not that. It's not based on theories of sustainability. It's based on how cheaply land can get amassed, and how quickly houses can go up. And then, like, on top of that, we've designed this lifestyle in our head about how we want to live and what demonstrates success and economic success in our own lives. And that's having this sort of eighth of an acre property with grass on the front and back lawn, and a large house that possibly requires several air conditioners for some reason. And the reality is, like, that's not a sustainable practice. We've got to start getting into our heads that we need to live a little bit differently within our means, both as a planet and society, but from a municipal government perspective, within the means of that budget that's going to have to pay for these things. When a long water pipe breaks down, it's very expensive. When it's serving more people in a smaller area, it's actually the cost can get shared more effectively between the residents in that community. And so I think that's one challenge. Is not all of it's in a municipality's hands, because so much of our, at least in Ontario, our land use system is dependent on the private sector, and they have certain rights, and it's not all governed by sustainable values. It's much more about economic ones. So when you take those three spheres, it almost entirely ignores the environmental. It somewhat ignores the social aspects, and almost entirely is focused on building out communities based on economic factors, which is a mistake. It's that they're not factoring in the other two sort of lenses or legs to the stool. And so I think that's one of the challenges. Another is change is hard. People feel that any change is a direct affront on their way of life. And we see this with the rhetoric around when we even look to redesign a roadway that doesn't take any space away from anyone else. And all of a sudden it's a war on this, a war on that, or just this constant struggle between polar opposites, when it's not at all. Like I call myself a cyclist, but I'm also a driver on occasion. I'm a pedestrian more than I am a cyclist, and I'm a transit rider. And the reality is we need people to feel like they're part of more than one camp in order for us to be able to effectively change the system so that it's safe for everyone and more efficient overall. That rebalancing, though, does can be seen as coming at a cost to some. And so we have to figure out a way so people feel a little bit more involved in the change, and perhaps a little bit more empathy towards other people in that equation that are being impacted, right, or whose lives are being improved in one way or another. You look at the dedicated bus lanes in some communities where drivers and businesses say, well, wait a second, like this is taken away from my quality of life. And then you look at the thousands of people riding the bus, and there's a significant portion of people whose lives are being made a whole heck of a lot better than they were before, waiting for that bus in the freezing cold. If you're listening from Canada, you know what I'm talking about. And so you've got like that rebalancing. People need to feel the empathy for others around them, and I think need to have a stronger and firmer commitment for us looking at the efficiency of the system overall and improving it, rather than just trying to get you from A to B as fast as is humanly possible, because that's not safe and it's not sustainable.
Yeah, I think, you hit the nail on the head, as it were, that change is hard. And, involving people in the change, giving choices, those types of things, maybe get more people on board faster, the what's in it for them kind of approach. What strategies have you seen that have worked well to improve the sustainability in cities?
Well, some of the strategies that I've seen that have functioned well have been, one is trying new things, and through pilot projects and demonstrating them. I have found, though, you're still going to have people that just don't believe the data. And that could be on any side of an argument. But you have some people that just refute the data that's presented to them because of they've got biases that they're bringing forward, or preconceived notions about how the world works. And those are tough to break. One great example was the economic study we did for the Bloor Street bike lane, that not only measured the changes in purchasing within the pilot area, but also the areas around it and some control areas that were quite similar at the other end of the city. And what they found, that while cyclists tended to spend less money on individual trips, they tended to spend more money overall in the area where the bike lane was. And that was a hard pill for many of those businesses and maybe others in the city to swallow, that they could just have that level of purchasing power. But a lot of that comes from the bias of who's cycling. Well, I got to tell you, go down to Bay Street on a busy day and count the bikes versus cars that are parking in some of those towers. And I got to say, there's been a pretty big rebalancing of who's taken what method, partly because they're choosing to take a more efficient method for their own time and probably their own quality of life. I would add in. And so it's not there may be some economic differences in the profiles of the individuals that are choosing certain modes of transportation, but it's not a hard and fast rule. And so when we did these studies, it was quite clear from the data that they had a net sort of positive, if not a net negative impact on spending in the pilot area, the loss of what was a minuscule amount of parking. And in reality, it was having a huge positive impact on all road users, including drivers and pedestrians. as a result of the reduced number of conflicting points. And it was really hard for people to accept that. And so I think the pilots can be seen in both lights. It's a lower bar. It's a lower bar to enter in at. But also you still have to sort of overcome some of these biases that people bring into place. I think though that opening up a dialogue when people get to have some one-on-one time with folks that might see the world in a slightly different light tends to open their eyes up more. At least I felt that prior to the pandemic. And now as we start to sort of reemerge and start to get together to have these dialogues about how our cities to grow, I'm hopeful that will once again sort of bring about some kind of change in people's mindsets. It really is true that this adage, if you build it, they will come. People have for decades said that we would cycle more if only there was better, safer infrastructure. And for certainty, as we build out this network, more people are coming now. In some areas, the growth is faster than others, but things take time. When you're going from less than 1% of people daily cycling, you can't expect that to go to 20% overnight. But you have a street like, and as in my own neighborhood, Shaw Street in downtown Toronto was a small contraflow lane that was added. We went from 700 cyclists a day, which was pretty good by a lot of standards, to 4,500. And it may be the only street in Canada, maybe North America, let's call it east of the Rockies, that have more bikes than cars on it currently on an average day in the summertime. So the adage is true. It just takes a little time to readjust. People got to get comfortable with changing their daily routine and challenging themselves, because people have become so afraid of the road. Like I grew up in downtown Toronto, riding on the road with no helmet. Right. And over time, this fear was developed. Now, wearing a helmet isn't a bad thing to do. I do it now, and I do it proudly. But it wasn't a thing back then. And something happened at some point in time that really made people afraid of going out and cycling, or even ashamed to be walking to places or to be taking public transit. We've got to have that shift back. And it does take time. But as things get more convenient and people feel safer in using those other methods of transportation, and frankly feel better about them, I think that we'll see a much more massive changeover. But it starts with building proper infrastructure, sidewalks, bike lanes, and better public transit.
You hit, a point that really reflects on me when I travel, and you see people using bike lanes and public transit and walking, and those are just the way that you get about. I was in Amsterdam last year, and just the culture of walking and biking for sure. And the ways that they've accommodated how they need to, get groceries or transport their kids around or things like that. So, there is that culture shift. I think in North America, you have some type of prestige if you are a driver of a car. My last question is about measurement. And I think, what we measure, and as you say, the data sometimes isn't accepted because personal experience sort of trumps what those measurements are. But are there types of measurements or frameworks that cities can use? You use the pilot project. I know we tracked things like driver time, trip time, and number of cyclists, and as you say, the economy of the stores along that street. Is there a framework that cities that are listening to this podcast could look to measure, whether they are at least moving in the direction of being sustainable?
Well, conceptually, I think a great measure is this notion of 880s. You're building for your cities for people under 8 and over 80.
Right.
And the more that they use them, the better off. There's one interesting measure I'd love to have remembered which jurisdiction used it. I believe it may have been Copenhagen, but it was the number of women that are on bicycles, because it measures a couple of different aspects of the sort of environmental, social, and economic sphere. That is an important measure. If you are building infrastructure that's comfortable for all levels of user and all walks of life, I think that those two lenses should be front and center in this. if you have a system where people's transportation methods are based on their economic position, you've got a really big problem of social instability there. Government investments need to be reflective of this. There's an adage that says, show me your budget, I'll show you your values. I think that that's an important thing to remember, that like if you're spending a certain amount on road infrastructure, make sure that it's reflective of the type of change you want to see in your city. There's several different measures of how close people have access to certain things. We did it for years with arenas in the city of Toronto, so outdoor hockey rinks.
Right.
There was actually a measure of how far do people have to travel to get to the rink. They did that for community centers and parks for a long, long time. How much park space per capita? Well, how long do you have to walk to get to a public transit stop? How long do you have to walk? How long does your population, not you individually, but on average, how far does your population have to walk to get to a public transit stop, to a bike lane, to appropriate pedestrian crossings? Like those, I think you need to come up with metrics that are better reflective of the way your city's built. And I don't think there's one method that prescribes them. There certainly are for transit stops. How far will people walk for public transit? So coming up with your own metrics that are the bar for how to get people out of their cars is, I think, an important thing for cities to look for and then look to implement them.
Thanks, Mike, for joining me today. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I think as complex as the issue is, it's so essential and so part of everybody's everyday life. You know, how do they get their groceries? How do they get to and from their schools or their jobs or their recreational activities? So even though when we use terms like economically, socially, environmentally, safety, those types of things, sound fairly lofty, but what has come out in our conversation today is just how much this impacts everybody's everyday life. So thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Change for Good Roads is a podcast of Parachute, Canada's national injury prevention charity, whose mission is for Canadians to live long lives to the fullest by preventing serious and fatal injuries. We release episodes of this podcast monthly on the second Tuesday of the month. On the next episode, we'll be talking about accessibility and road safety. If you know someone who would be interested in this podcast, please help us connect with them by sharing this link. Subscribing and giving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts will help listeners find this Change for Good Roads podcast.
This is Story Studio Network.